I'm Holly Higbee-Jansen, and I teach Lightroom Quick Start and iPhone photography for the BPSOP School of Photography. I also teach workshops for Jansen Photo Expeditions. Today, we are going to be talking about 5 images from the BPSOP community. And let's get started. So the next picture I will be talking about is called Beautiful Rock Formations and 4,000-Year-Old Drawings. This picture was done by Margie Pangione, and the picture was taken at the Valley of Fire in Nevada, and she shot it with a Canon G3X. I don't see any information about her camera settings, and because I teach the Lightroom class, I'm going to show you a little bit of adjustments that I'd make on this picture with Lightroom. So the reason why usually in Lightroom, if you hit the I button when you have a picture brought up in the develop module, it'll bring up the information about this particular picture. So you see the name of the picture, the date it was taken, and this is the file size of the picture. And I have set up Lightroom to give me this information, but it gives me no information, again, about the lens settings. So if I go back to my develop module in Lightroom, I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of the composition here. Now, because this picture is all about the drawings right here in the lower left corner, as well as the graphics, the texture of the rocks, my first comment would be to really highlight these drawings. And I see that part of this drawing right here over in the lower left-hand corner has been cut out. So if, I don't know what the situation was to photograph these also, so you may not have been able to get down into a lower position where you would include this smaller drawing down here. But if I was to go back and shoot this in a perfect world, I would shoot from a lower angle and really incorporate all of this petroglyph as well. Pictograph, petroglyph. And also because of the light coming through here and the texture of the rocks, I think I would really try and highlight that a lot in Lightroom. So if you go in your develop module in Lightroom, I can play around. Usually what I do is I play around with the exposure and the contrast first of all, just to see what's available in this particular picture. I also keep a good eye on the histogram, so it looks to me like a pretty balanced picture. There's no spikes on either the lowlights or the highlights in this particular picture. Shadows, I might want to bring up the shadows here, so I bring up a little bit of this information right here. Whites, I'd like to kind of drop back a little. I do see a little bit of brightness on the rocks back here. And so basically what I do is I just play around with this develop module and I go through each setting and see what I can find. One other thing that I see about the composition in this particular picture, there's a little bit of a inclusion into the picture right here. I'm not sure what that is. So basically what I would do is I would just crop that out just a little bit, very easily done. And so then I continue with my settings. Tone curve actually does a lot of the same things that the basic curve does, but it's a little bit more intense as far as the adjustments are concerned. So the darks and the lights. If you want to compare the before and after, you hit the YY button, so you can see some of the adjustments that I've made already on the picture here. Then for sure I would sharpen this a little bit more. Sharpening is usually what you would do at the very end, so I'm going to wait until I do some more adjustments on here. What I like to use in Lightroom quite a bit is the radial filter, so that I can select areas of my image and just make my selections on those particular areas. So on this particular one, I'm just highlighting the petroglyphs. And so I'm going to really just kind of punch those out and really make those show up here. So those become a real feature of this particular picture. Then what I like to do also is maybe I would go in and do another radial adjustment and play with the exposure or the clarity on this particular rock over here, just to bring out that great texture. And just play around with that. Same thing with this piece right here. Go back and do my radial adjustment. So that what I like to do is actually break up the picture into segments so that I can look at the areas where I really want to highlight. Then I can actually go into my adjustment tool brush, and I can brush in some more detail in here. So maybe in this rock I might want to darken the exposure just a little bit. See how it's starting to bring out the more information in the texture of the rocks. And maybe I'll just kind of paint a little bit here. Paint with light is what I call it, and just to bring out some areas in this picture that would be more interesting. Then, as I mentioned before, I would go down and do my sharpening. Then this picture may have already been sharpened, so I don't really know what has been done in this particular picture. On the sharpening, if you hit the Option Alt key in your sharpening, you can actually see where the sharpening is going to be affected. And then I might add a little bit of noise reduction as well. And then the final thing that I do is I would add some effects at the bottom, post-crop vignetting. And I think that would be what I would do. And if you compare the original to what I just did, you can just see that there's a lot more detail showing up in the picture. It's bringing your eye right into this area back here. And for sure, I would highlight this area of your pictographs. So beautiful spot. Good job with this picture. Thank you for submitting. This next picture is called Slow Shutter Speed Photo, and it's by Sanoop. And Sanoop says, I am a beginner in photography, posting images shot on manual mode in my Canon 700D DSLR. I teach the Lightroom Quick Start class for the BPSOP community, and so I'm going to show you what I would do in Lightroom to better this photograph a little bit. This is a great evening shot of a fountain. The first thing that I would do, I would adjust the composition just a little bit. Now, I see a few issues with both the straightness of the picture. You can see that these columns are a little bit off center, and also there's some areas in the picture that are blown out, and being blown out meaning there's no information in the highlights right here. And you can see that that is reflected here in the histogram. If you're familiar with how a histogram works, see this spike here on the far right? That's showing that there's an area in the picture with no information. So that could be this area right here. Most probably is reflecting in this area right here. So a very easy way to fix that, and in this case, would be to go up to my my crop overlay and just change the composition just a little bit. I'll just pull in the corners to get rid of those real hot spots in the picture. At the same time, I can actually adjust the straightness of the picture, so I'm looking at the columns right here and following the guidelines in the crop overlay so that now they appear straight. And I don't think that that really affects the composition too much. I like the repetitive circular elements here as well as these repetitive lines. So the other thing that I see is it has a very yellow cast because of the type of lighting. It's probably you know, some kind of a tungsten lighting. So I can very slightly adjust the color temperature. That is not something that I would recommend that you play with a lot, but in this case it does look a little overly yellow. Then I just like to go through in Lightroom and just kind of play with the different settings, the exposure, the contrast, highlights I might bring down a little bit in this picture. You're still seeing that the highlights are a little bit overexposed in this particular shot. And there's really nothing that you can do about that. You can see right here that it's overexposed. If I play with my exposure, it's still not going to have any information in that particular area. We can play with the highlights and try to bring that down. Clarity, which will sharpen it up just a little bit. Vibrance, I kind of like this pink tone to the fountain. So either you can actually pull it back and give it a little bit more white, or actually increase the vibrance. Saturation I don't really play with too much, because as you can see, if I pull the saturation over too much, it's just going to be a little bit over exaggerated as far as the color is concerned. Tone curve, actually I might be able to pull back the highlights a little bit more with the tone curve, and the lights and the darks in this particular picture. So it really depends upon the image. I just like to kind of go in and play and see what looks nice. Detail, I might go into and add a little bit of sharpening, add some noise reduction as well in this particular shot. I do like to do some post-crop vignetting, and what I'm trying to do here is actually diminish this light over here that's a little bit distracting. And then what we can do is we can actually go in and use this particular tool. It's called the adjustment brush, and I can adjust it to whatever size I want. And maybe if I want to highlight these streams of water a little bit, I can actually paint with light here, and then I can go over to my palette and adjust whether I'd like it to be a little brighter, a little more contrast, maybe pull down the highlights a little bit and increase the whites, bring down the blacks a little bit. So now you can start to see a little more detail in the water. And you can actually see, maybe that's a little bit too much, don't like that one. So I'm just playing around with the light and the contrast here. Dehazing. And if we wanted to, we could actually go into the color palette here and play around with the color. So if we're looking at the hues in the purples, maybe I could desaturate the purples just a little bit. So what it's doing is it's actually going to bring the white of the water back just a little bit, but still give us this really nice color. So if you look at this, is the adjusted version versus the original. So I just brought in a little bit more color, changed the composition a little bit, and tried to bring down the shadows in the back. So thank you for submitting, and I hope you're able to play around a little bit in Lightroom with this picture. Thank you. The next picture is called Frames on the Porch, and it's by Georgette Grossman. And Georgette says, I went into the country with a friend to photograph the fall leaves. She also knew of an abandoned store with lots of stuff on the porch. I was drawn to a stack of old frames and an old torn print. The light was bright when I photographed the image. I post-processed in Lightroom and then added texture in NYX Analog Effects Pro. Are the bright areas still too bright compared to the shadow areas? It was taken at noon with the Fuji X Pro 2 18 to 135 millimeter lens, 34.5 millimeter focal length, f8, ISO 400 at 1/80th of a second. So I think this is a great find. What a fun thing to photograph, and I love the subject of this particular image, and the shadows are great. As far as the bright areas still being too bright compared to the shadow areas, I don't think so. I mean, it's not showing out that they're overly exposed. Actually, in my opinion, I would add even more contrast to it, so that it's looking very intentional, that you want the shadows to be a part of your image. So if I bring it back into Lightroom, I teach the Lightroom Quick Start class, so I'm going to go through some quick adjustments that I might do in Lightroom with this particular picture. So on my screen, I'm showing that I would even bring down the exposure a little and bring up the contrast some. So now you can really see the shadows. It's a little bit more intentional about the shadows. Maybe bring down the highlights so that so it's not quite so bright. And I like to just kind of go through the different adjustments within Lightroom to see what looks right. And basically the way I like to approach Lightroom is painting with light. And so I might adjust the vibrance a little bit on it. And usually I don't touch the saturation too much. Tone curve, I can just fine tune some of my details on here. And really start to bring out some of those shadows and more definition in the shadows. And then actually I would go in and do a post-crop vignette and really start to bring in your attention to the middle of that picture. So I think that's what I would do to this particular picture. Even just make it a lot more dramatic, make the shadows feel much more intentional. And if you can check your before and after. So this is the before that was submitted and the after where I did a little bit more of adjustment to show more drama in the shadows and a little bit more vibrance in the actual pictures. So really interesting subject, and thank you for submitting. The next picture is called Lifeguard Stand 2E, and it's done by Swaby111. It's taken with a Canon 6D at 1/100th of a second at f4, 1600 ISO at sunrise in Honolulu. So I have a couple of comments about this picture. I love the whole scene, and it has this beautiful, nice warm quality of light because it's taken at sunrise. And I see, if I'm looking at your settings, I see you have it at 1/100th of a second at f4 and 1600 ISO. In a perfect world, I would have my settings at probably about 200 ISO. I would have it mounted on a tripod, and I would have my f-stop at about f22. And the reason for all of this is your smaller apertures are going to give you a wider depth of field, so that it'll be in focus from front to back. I don't see any focus quality problems in this particular picture, but also it'll allow you to get at a lower ISO, which will have less noise. And again, I don't see noise in this picture either, but if you become very intentional about what your exposure settings are when you're taking a picture, you'll have more consistent results with it. The other thing that I would do with this is right off the bat, as far as composition is concerned, I would change the composition just a little bit. So I'm going to show you what I would do with this particular picture in Lightroom. I teach the Lightroom Quick Start class, and I will show you in just a few minutes how we can go through this picture quite quickly and make some pretty dramatic changes on it. So I would go to my crop overlay tool and actually adjust this composition so that our Lifeguard stand is not quite so centered and we have a little bit less grass. You probably don't need to have as much grass to tell this particular story. My other comment would be my feeling about this picture is the story is about the palm trees, the beautiful sunrise, the color of the clouds. I'm not sure that this particular element actually adds to the picture, but I'll show you how I would work with that as well. So when I work with Lightroom, I basically just go through all my adjustments in my basic tool panel. I play with my contrast, my exposure, play with highlights just to see how this is going to work and how it's going to look better. Play with my whites, blacks, clarity. She's going to give it a little bit more sharpening to it. Play with the vibrance a little bit because you can bring out the color in the clouds. I don't do much with saturation because if I was to increase the saturation, you can see how it starts to look a little bit cartoonish. So I prefer to use vibrance rather than saturation. Tone curve actually will give us some more detailed adjustments, especially if you have some highlights or low light problems, which this picture doesn't have. If you refer to the histogram up here, you can see that it's a pretty balanced exposure. We're not showing any spikes in the blacks or any spikes in the highlights. So I think that's what I would do with that. Then I would actually take my graduated filter and actually pull that down from the top, and you can see that it's going to start to bring in some nice color into the sky. Then we can actually play with our exposure and our contrast without making it look too unnatural, and just play around with that adjustment. I like using that particular one, that graduated filter, for skies. Gives you a little bit more clarity in the sky. And then the other thing that I love to do with the toolbar in Lightroom is use this adjustment brush. And what I can do is I can come over to our clouds and start to paint in some light. And now you can see what I just painted in is obviously too dark. So I can actually adjust the exposure for that and the contrast to just give a little bit more definition in just the clouds. So now we're really seeing probably more what the sunrise looked like. I can adjust my blacks here, adjust my clarity for the sky, and then the last thing that I would do, I'm not sure if you've already sharpened this. I have a feeling that it may have already been sharpened. But normally I would do sharpening, a little bit noise reduction, and then I would lastly bring in a vignette to really start to bring your eye into the subject of this particular picture. So if you look at the before and after, you can see that it's a little sharper, a little bit more dramatic with the color, and then we talked a bit about the difference in the composition. So thank you for submitting this beautiful picture. Would love to have been there with you at that sunrise in Honolulu. So thank you for submitting. The next picture I'm going to talk about is called Grand Vista, a vertical perspective by Gary Lang. The image is an unedited film scan of a shot taken the 25th of October at the Grand Canyon. The weather had just cleared by the time we arrived at the particular stop along the south rim. The camera, Nikon f4, Provia 400 film. Lens was a Tokina 28-70 f2.8, 1/90th of a second, handheld. I tried to capture not only the beauty of the scene, but also the calm and quiet we experienced. So this is an amazing scene for sure. And I want to give you some suggestions on how you can improve this particular scene. My first suggestion would be on your settings. It says that you shot with the Tokina 28-70 f2.8, so I'm assuming that's the lens is at 2.8, not that you shot the image at 2.8. It says 1/90th of a second, handheld. So I don't know what your aperture was when you were shooting this particular scene. A landscape like this, the aperture is best to be f18, f22, something like that, so that you get the widest range of depth of field in that particular case. And so not knowing what aperture you used is hard to tell. But anyway, I do have some suggestions that we can do in Lightroom that would improve this image. I do like the composition. I think it could be improved a little bit. It seems quite dark in the lower parts of the image. So my first thing that I would do would be to probably bring up the composition just a little bit so that not so much of the dark area is in the bottom of the frame. And so that kind of brightens things up quite a bit. The other thing that I noticed was that we could bring in some detail into the sky and maybe brighten up this foreground area a little bit so that there's more dimension in the particular image. So I teach the Lightroom Quick Start class, and so my intention for you is to learn to use Lightroom quickly and efficiently so that you can get through your digital editing quite quickly. So the first thing that I notice when I come into Lightroom is I go into my basic settings and I play with my exposure, my contrast, my highlights. And with the highlights, you can see that I can bring out some detail in the clouds pretty easily, bring up some detail in the shadows, and bring up some blacks, a little bit more clarity, vibrance. I'm noticing the colors are going a little strange with the vibrance and the saturation, so you just have to watch that. Saturation for sure will alter the color of this. But one thing I really like about this image is the way the shadows are playing in the canyons here, and the clouds for sure. Tone curve, what that does is it actually will do some of the same settings that are in the basic settings, but they're a little bit more fine-tuned. So I always go into the tone settings as well just to play around with it, see how I can better an image that way as well. So then if you go up to this toolbar in Lightroom, those are adjustment toolbars, and I would go into a graduated filter for a sky such as this, and I can just give it a little bit more detail. Now the way that it came out just as I did it is obviously going to be too saturated, so I would pull down my saturation bar in this way, play around with the exposure so it doesn't look so cartoonish, and just be careful that it doesn't look overly saturated. Play around with the shadows. And then what I like to do with Lightroom is I can actually pick certain areas of the image that I might want to work on. So for sure this piece right here, this rock, I think could definitely stand out a little bit more. So I will create a targeted adjustment and just lighten the exposure on that and play around with the contrast and the exposure to just give that a little bit more dimension to your picture so that that stands out a little bit more in the foreground. And there's also ways to really fine-tune those adjustments. Then I would also take an adjustment up here in the clouds. And again, we need to watch for overly saturated areas. So on these clouds right here, I can actually increase the exposure a little bit, make them a little bit more dramatic without overdoing it. And then I would go in and possibly do some targeted adjustments here in the canyons. So what I can do is basically what I like to do, you can see where if I show the selected mask overlay, it shows where I painted in the canyons there, and I can affect the exposure and the contrast in the canyons. And so probably giving it more what you saw when you were standing at this scene. The other thing that looks a little odd is the color here, so I may play with the saturation just a little bit to pull down that color. Then I also like to do is a vignetting, post-crop vignetting, to give it a little bit more detail, that bring the eye in, do a little bit of a dehaze. And here's my final version of this particular picture. So you can see what I've done is, if you compare it to the original, is I've brought out the exposure in the foreground here and also sharpened it so it's a little bit clearer. Actually brought in more detail into the clouds in the background and also above the higher clouds. The other thing that I did was darkened this area just a little bit and selectively darkened some of the areas right here, and did a little bit of a vignette here across the bottom. And I think it gives you the effect of the clouds, the shadows, the clouds, and the dramatic clouds in the distance. So and also I think the cropping made a big difference, since the bottom part of the crop was pretty dark to start off with. So thank you for submitting this dramatic image, and keep shooting.